I was standing in my kitchen when it happened, my hands still wrapped around my coffee mug, the steam rising like nothing in my life was about to change. My phone buzzed at 7:42 a.m. It was a message from my son. "Don't expect me to take care of you in old age. I have my own life and family." I read it once. Then again. Then a third time, slower, as if the words might soften if I gave them time. They didn't. My eyes dropped to the kitchen table where a bank letter lay open, the envelope torn without care. The paper felt heavier than it should have when I touched it. Date, March 18th. Amount, $22,400. Authorization, my signature. Only it wasn't mine. My son had just told me, in plain language, that I was on my own when I became old and fragile. Yet at the very same moment, someone was already reaching into the life I had built, helping themselves to my money as if it were owed. The refrigerator hummed behind me. The clock ticked. The house stayed quiet. I stood there, unable to move, thinking only one thing. How could they do this to me? If you want to hear how this ended, stay with me and listen until the very end. My name is Margaret Hill. I am 71 years old, and I have lived my entire life in Madison, Wisconsin. I know the sound of the lake when the wind turns cold, the way snow settles on the steps in February, and how quiet a house becomes once children grow up and move on. I built my life here slowly, with intention, and I never expected applause for it. For 35 years, I worked in finance. I was the woman who arrived early, who kept careful files, who double-checked numbers before signing anything. I understood budgets, risk, and long-term planning. I learned that stability is not luck, it is repetition, discipline, and saying no more often than yes. I paid my bills on time. I lived within my means. I prepared for the future even when the present felt heavy. When my husband passed away, everything changed, but nothing collapsed. Grief settled into the rooms like dust, but I kept going. I learned to live alone without becoming small. I fixed leaky faucets, handled paperwork, and cooked simple meals for myself. I slept with a lamp on in the hallway, not because I was afraid, but because the light reminded me I was still here. Still capable. Still responsible for my own life. My son, Ethan, grew up watching this woman. He knew I wasn't fragile. He knew I didn't panic when problems appeared. He also knew something else, something I never discussed in detail but never hid either. I owned my home outright. I had savings. I had investments I had protected carefully for years. I had planned not just for retirement, but for independence. I never talked about money at the dinner table. I didn't wave it around or use it to control anyone. I believed money should be quiet. Ethan learned early that I did not live extravagantly and that I did not ask for help unless it was truly needed. When he struggled in his 20s, I helped in measured ways. When he recovered, I stepped back. I thought I was teaching him balance. When he married Lauren, I welcomed her warmly. I respected their space. I told myself that good mothers know when to loosen their grip. I didn't interfere. I didn't question their decisions. I believed trust was the foundation of family, and that love meant giving people room to be themselves. I never imagined that trust could be studied, weighed, and used. Looking back now, I see how confident I was in the wrong things. I believed experience protected me. I believed competence made me untouchable. I believed that because I understood finances, no one would ever look at me and see an opportunity instead of a mother. That belief followed me quietly into that kitchen on that morning. And it would not survive what came next. Ethan and his wife Lauren always looked caring from the outside. They called often enough to seem attentive. They visited on holidays, brought flowers, asked polite questions, and smiled at the right moments. Lauren hugged me tightly when she arrived and complimented the house as if she were seeing it for the first time each visit. Ethan spoke gently, almost carefully, as though I were something delicate that might crack if handled too roughly. For a long time, I told myself this was love maturing into something quieter. They asked about my health. They asked if I was sleeping well. They asked whether the stairs ever bothered my knees. I answered honestly but lightly. I didn't want to invite worry where it wasn't needed. Still, I noticed how certain questions repeated, how concern slowly shifted direction. They were less interested in how I felt and more interested in how long I planned to stay in the house. They asked if the roof had been replaced recently. They wondered aloud about property taxes. They mentioned friends whose parents had downsized for convenience. Each comment arrived wrapped in reason, but they lingered longer than they should have. I began to sense a change I couldn't yet name. Their visits were no longer about shared time. They were about observation. Lauren looked around as if cataloging rooms. Ethan asked questions that felt rehearsed. When I spoke about my plans, they listened only long enough to redirect the conversation somewhere else. I wasn't a mother to them anymore. I was a plan. I remember the first time that thought frightened me. It arrived quietly, without drama, while we were clearing plates after dinner. Lauren laughed and said, "You've done so well for yourself," and Ethan nodded with an expression that wasn't pride, but calculation. I felt it then, sharp and cold, like a draft slipping through a closed window. Still, I doubted myself. Pride told me I was imagining things. I had raised my son. I trusted my judgment. I told myself not to grow bitter, not to see threats where none existed. I believed love deserved generosity of interpretation. But generosity, I learned, can be mistaken for permission. They began to speak to me with a tone I hadn't heard before. Softer, slower, almost instructional. They explained things I already knew. They offered advice I hadn't requested. When I mentioned a purchase, Ethan frowned slightly. When I talked about travel, Lauren asked if it was necessary. Their concern felt less like care and more like supervision. I realized then that something fundamental had shifted. They no longer saw me as capable. Or perhaps they did, and that was precisely the problem. Capability meant assets. Stability meant access. My independence had become something to manage. I felt pride turn into something harder. Bitterness, yes, but also clarity. Because once you see how someone is measuring you, you cannot pretend you are still standing on equal ground. The first crack was so small I almost felt foolish noticing it at all. That is how these things begin, not with shouting or cruelty, but with a sentence spoken lightly, almost kindly, and left behind like a hairline fracture in glass. We were sitting at my kitchen table one afternoon, the same table where I had paid bills for decades, sorted mail, and written birthday cards. The late light came through the window, soft and warm. I had made soup, the kind my husband used to like. Lauren complimented it. Ethan loosened his tie and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, with a half smile, "at least we know you're financially set." He said it as if it were reassurance. As if he were putting my mind at ease. Lauren nodded. That must be such a comfort. I smiled then. I remember doing it automatically, the way women my age often do, smoothing over moments that feel slightly off. I even felt a quiet pride. I had worked hard for that stability. I thought my son was acknowledging it, maybe even respecting it. But that wasn't what the comment was. It wasn't appreciation. It wasn't relief. It was an evaluation. After that afternoon, I noticed how often money slipped into conversation, even when it didn't belong there. It arrived disguised as curiosity, concern, practicality. Ethan asked where I kept my important documents. Lauren wondered aloud how complicated my accounts must be at my age. They framed everything as help, as foresight, as love. "You shouldn't have everything scattered," Ethan said once. "What if there was an emergency?" Lauren added. I told them I had everything organized. I had always been organized. They exchanged a look that passed too quickly for me to challenge, but not too quickly to feel. They suggested small changes. Harmless ones, they said. Adding a name, just in case. Consolidating accounts to make things simpler. They spoke gently, patiently, the way people do when they believe resistance is temporary. When I hesitated, they reassured me. You can trust us. We're family. We just want what's best for you. I told myself I was being overly cautious. I had always believed that refusing help could be just as dangerous as accepting too much. I didn't want to become rigid. I didn't want to be the difficult mother. So I allowed limited access. Shared small pieces of information. Nothing that felt irreversible. That was my mistake. Because predators do not begin by taking. They begin by asking. I missed the shift in their tone when I said no. I missed how enthusiasm cooled when I asserted myself. I missed how warmth returned the moment I softened. Each time I explained myself, each time I compromised to keep the peace, I unknowingly taught them where my boundaries thinned. Looking back, I see it clearly now. That comment at the table was not about my comfort. It was about measurement. They weren't asking if I was secure. They were calculating what my security could become. And I let that first crack stay open, telling myself it was nothing, never imagining how wide it would grow, or how much would quietly slip through before I finally understood what was happening. After that, nothing exploded. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations. Everything stayed civil, which made it harder to name what was happening. But the air between us shifted, and once it did, I felt it everywhere. They began speaking to me differently. Slower. Softer. As if I needed time to catch up. You shouldn't spend that much, Ethan said one afternoon when I mentioned replacing my old refrigerator. It had begun to hum loudly at night, the sound drifting down the hallway like a warning. His voice was calm, almost reasonable, but it wasn't advice. It was correction. Lauren smiled, the way people do when they believe they are being kind. What if you need that money later? Later became their favorite word. Later meant a future they seemed to be planning without me. They started offering opinions before I finished sentences. They questioned small decisions. They asked how often I checked my accounts, whether I tracked expenses monthly or weekly, whether I had thought through certain choices carefully enough. I answered less freely, but by then they already knew enough to keep pushing. They remembered details with unsettling precision. When I said no, the room cooled. Well, we're just worried, Lauren would say, her voice light but firm. We're thinking ahead, Ethan added. Ahead for whom was never clarified. I noticed how often they positioned themselves as necessary. If anything ever happened. If you weren't able to manage things. If you needed help quickly. Each phrase placed me one step closer to dependency, even though nothing in my life suggested I was anywhere near it. I was healthy. I was capable. I was still the same woman who had managed complex finances for decades. But they watched my money very closely. When I traveled, they asked how much it cost. When I made a purchase, they asked whether it was essential. When I spoke about plans, they redirected the conversation toward caution. Approval became conditional. Warmth arrived only when I complied. I began explaining myself in my own house. That realization came late one night, lying awake, listening to the refrigerator hum. I replayed conversations not with anger, but with analysis. I noticed patterns. I noticed how often I softened my words to avoid discomfort. How I justified decisions that required no justification. I hated that most of all. I had spent my life standing firmly inside my choices, and now I was shrinking sentences, trimming opinions, leaving parts of myself unsaid for the sake of peace. I felt like a guest in my own life, carefully polite, overly accommodating. This wasn't care. It was control being tested. They were measuring resistance. Learning which objections faded if they waited long enough. Each interaction felt like a negotiation I had never agreed to enter, with rules I hadn't written. And still, I didn't confront them. I told myself families go through phases. I told myself tension doesn't always mean danger. I told myself that keeping the peace was the mature choice. I had no proof yet, only discomfort, and I didn't want to accuse without certainty. But tension doesn't disappear when ignored. It tightens. By the time that morning arrived, the message on my phone, the letter on the table, the number printed in ink, the ground beneath me had already been carefully prepared. I just hadn't realized how close I was to losing my footing. That morning did not arrive loudly. There was no thunder, no sudden panic. It came quietly, the way bad news often does, slipping into an ordinary moment and changing it forever. The kitchen was still dim, the sky outside just beginning to lighten. I stood by the counter in my robe, one hand around my coffee mug, the other holding my phone. The coffee smelled right, but I realized later I never took a sip. My attention had already drifted somewhere else. The phone buzzed at 7:42 a.m. I looked at the screen and saw Ethan's name. For a moment, I expected something practical. A question. A reminder. Anything but what followed. Don't expect me to take care of you in old age. I have my own life and family. The words were short. Clean. Final. I read them once, quickly. Then again, slower. Then a third time, as if repetition might change their meaning. It didn't. There was no anger in the message. No apology. Just a declaration, delivered with the confidence of someone who had already made peace with the decision. I felt something settle in my chest, not sharp enough to be pain, but heavy enough to be permanent. A door closing has a sound, even when it happens quietly. I set the phone down and noticed the envelope on the table again. It had arrived the day before, mixed in with grocery flyers and utility bills. I had opened it absent-mindedly earlier that morning, before the message, before I understood what I was about to see. Now I pulled it closer and smoothed the paper flat with my fingertips. I forced myself to slow down. Date, March 18th. Amount, $22,400. Authorization, my signature. I stared at the name at the bottom of the page. It looked like mine. Close enough that someone unfamiliar wouldn't hesitate. But I knew my own hand. I knew how my signature curved when I was tired, how the pressure changed at the end of my name. This was practiced. Confident. Familiar. And wrong. I sat down hard in the chair, the legs scraping softly against the floor. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen. The refrigerator hummed behind me. The clock on the wall ticked forward, unconcerned. I opened my laptop. My fingers moved without hesitation. Years of habit took over. I logged in, pulled statements, compared dates. One page led to another, then another. The numbers shifted as the truth slowly assembled itself. Withdrawals I did not remember approving. Transfers labeled emergency. Notes written in a voice meant to sound like mine. I went back further. Then further still. Almost $49,000 over 4 years. Each transaction came with a memory now. A call that had sounded urgent. A problem that had needed solving immediately. Ethan's voice, grateful, stressed, apologetic. Lauren's reassurance that it was temporary. I remembered telling myself that family helps family. That this was what savings were for. The coffee was cold by then, untouched. What struck me most was not the amount. It was the timing. The message on my phone wasn't honesty. It was distance. It was insurance. He had already decided I would not be part of his future responsibility. Now he was making sure I understood that clearly, while someone else was still quietly helping themselves to my past. I turned off the kitchen light and sat there in the half-dark, papers spread in front of me, my phone silent at last. And in that stillness, I understood something with perfect clarity. He had already made his choice. Now it was my turn. I turned off the kitchen light because the brightness felt intrusive, as if the room itself were demanding a reaction I wasn't ready to give. The switch clicked, and the space softened into shadow. Just enough light remained from the window to outline the table, the papers, the chair where I sat. I lowered myself down slowly, feeling the solid weight of the chair beneath me. My hands rested on the wood, palms flat. They were steady. That surprised me. I had expected trembling, or tears, or at least some visible sign that my life had cracked open. Instead, there was only quiet. The house continued as it always had. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked forward, second by second, indifferent. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its sound fading almost immediately. The world had not paused for my realization, and that, strangely, grounded me. I sat there for a long time without moving. Not frozen, thinking. And slowly, with a clarity that felt almost clinical, everything aligned. The comments I had brushed aside. The advice I hadn't asked for. The way concern always curved back toward money. Ethan's tone when finances came up. Lauren's watchful silences. The way warmth appeared when I agreed and disappeared when I didn't. None of it was accidental. None of it had been spontaneous. It had shape. It had direction. I thought again of that sentence at the table. At least we know you're financially set. I finally heard it the way it had been meant. They were not planning to support me when I was old. They were planning to extract what they could before that time ever arrived. My future had already been written without me in it. My role was not to be cared for, but to be used carefully, quietly, until there was nothing left to manage. The message on my phone hadn't been cruel. It had been efficient. It was the truth, delivered without decoration, once they believed they no longer needed my goodwill. And then another realization settled in, heavier than the rest. They believed I would accept this. They believed I would argue, plead, explain. That I would cling to the role of mother at any cost. That I would trade dignity for access, silence for belonging. They believed I would continue rescuing them even after being told, plainly, that I was on my own. That belief hurt more than the money ever could. Because it meant they did not see me. Not as I was. Not as I had always been. I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to think clearly. I examined the situation the way I once examined financial statements, without sentiment, without indulgence. Facts first. Feelings later. The facts were simple. The accounts were in my name. The assets were still mine. I was not confused. I was not incapable. And I was not trapped. What had been taken had been allowed. And what is allowed can be stopped. That understanding didn't bring relief, exactly. It brought weight. Responsibility. But also something solid beneath my feet. Resolve. The kind that does not announce itself. The kind that moves quietly and leaves no room for negotiation. I opened my eyes and looked at the papers again. I was finished waiting for explanations. Finished hoping for remorse. Finished pretending love would appear where intention had already disappeared. He had made his choice. And now, with complete clarity, I was ready to make mine. I didn't call Ethan back. I didn't send a long message asking what he meant, or why he chose that morning to say it. I had already read enough. The truth was on paper, in timestamps and transaction codes, and in a signature that mimicked mine too well. I rinsed my mug, set it upside down on a towel, and made myself do the next small thing. That was how I kept from falling apart, one concrete step after another. I gathered the bank letter, the printed statements, and my notebook, the one with the worn blue cover where I kept account numbers written in careful block letters. I lit the little lavender candle by the sink, not for comfort exactly, but for steadiness. The scent reminded me to breathe. By 9 o'clock I was dressed, hair pinned back, lipstick I rarely wore on weekdays. Not for vanity, for armor. I took my keys from the hook by the door, the metal cool against my fingers, and drove to the branch where I'd done business for years, the same brick building with the fern in the lobby and the bowl of peppermints on the counter. The young teller smiled at me the way people smile at older women, polite, a little distant. I didn't take a peppermint. I need to speak with the manager, I said. In the small office behind the glass, I laid the letter on the desk and slid it forward. This is not my signature, I told him. My voice sounded steady, even to me. And I need you to flag every recent transfer that involved Ethan Hill. He studied the page, then pulled up my accounts. Seeing the numbers on his screen made them feel more physical, like bruises you can't deny once you see them in daylight. He asked a few questions, routine ones, careful ones, and I answered without embellishment. I didn't offer a story. I offered facts. We went line by line. I pointed to withdrawals I did not authorize. He printed a report. He explained procedures. I listened, asked questions, took notes in my blue notebook. When he mentioned joint access and convenience arrangements, I felt heat rise in my throat, but I kept my hands still on my lap. I want every account that allows another person to move funds closed today, I said. And I want new ones opened in my name only. He hesitated, the way people do when they imagine a family argument they won't have to sit through. Mrs. Hill, that may create tension. It will create clarity, I replied. He arranged for new account numbers, new cards, new online credentials. I signed forms with my real signature slowly, deliberately, then watched him photocopy my ID. I asked for alerts on every transaction, not because I was panicking, but because I was done being surprised. Before I left, I took one peppermint after all and put it in my purse. I didn't eat it. I just wanted something small to mark the moment. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and called the fraud department. I held the phone away from my face for a second and looked at my hands. They were still steady. I gave the representative the dates, the amounts, the notes attached to each transfer. I asked for the case number and wrote it down. I asked what they would send me in writing. I asked how long records would remain accessible online. Each answer became another line in my notebook. From there I drove to my attorney. I hadn't seen him in years, but he still remembered my husband's estate paperwork. His office smelled of old books and lemon polish. I sat across from him and placed my folder on his desk like a weight I refused to carry alone. I need to change my will, I said. And I need a trust set up, something clean and specific. No confusion. No access. No surprises. He asked if I wanted to talk about why. I told him the minimum, a forged signature, unapproved transfers, a message that made it plain I would not be cared for. He didn't look shocked. He looked practical, which was exactly what I needed. We drafted new documents that afternoon. We removed Ethan as executor. We named a professional trustee. We tightened language around gifts and loans, requiring written agreements and independent verification. We added protections I never thought I'd need with my own child. When my hand cramped from signing, I paused and rolled my wrist, then kept going. Quiet work. Necessary work. By late afternoon I stopped at the post office and mailed a certified letter requesting written confirmation of the changes from the bank. Then I went home. The house smelled faintly of the soup I'd left in the pot. I turned the burner off, washed the spoon, and sat at the table again. I opened my laptop and changed every password I could remember, one by one, until the list in my notebook was crossed through like a finished task. I gathered old checkbooks and deposit slips and put them in a bag for shredding. I moved my important papers, deed, insurance, identification, into a locked cabinet and kept the key on the ring I wore around my wrist like a bracelet. Only then did I pick up my phone. I wrote one message to Ethan. I'm handling my affairs privately from now on. Do not attempt to access my accounts again. No anger. No pleading. No explanation. Just a boundary, put in writing, the way responsible people do. I didn't call anyone to vent. I didn't ask for a vote or a blessing. I took the framed photo of Ethan at 8 years old from the shelf, wiped a thumbprint from the glass, and set it back. Loving him had been real. But love didn't require surrender. I could hold grief in one hand and a boundary in the other. I wrote that down too, right under the case number, so I wouldn't forget it on a softer day. Not this time. Ever. Then I blocked him where I could and turned my phone face down. My hands finally trembled, not from fear, but from the strange relief of taking my life back. The lavender candle had burned low. I watched the flame for a moment, steady and small, and I let myself feel the truth of it. I didn't need their permission to protect what was mine. The silence lasted 3 days. Then the calls began. Ethan called first, early in the morning, the way he used to when he wanted something handled quickly. I watched the phone light up on the counter and let it ring. A minute later, Lauren's name appeared. Then again. Then a text followed, brief and carefully neutral. "Mom, something's wrong with the accounts." I didn't answer. By afternoon, the tone shifted. The messages grew longer, more emotional. Confused at first, then strained. Ethan wrote that a payment hadn't gone through. Lauren said there must have been a technical error. They asked if I had spoken to the bank, if I had changed something by accident. The word accident stayed with me. By evening, confusion turned into panic. Flights were missed. A credit card declined at a grocery store. An automatic transfer they relied on simply didn't arrive. I could picture it without being told, the pause at the checkout, the heat rising in their faces, the quiet argument in the car afterward. Control rarely announces how much it depends on access until access is gone. The next day, the apologies started. "I didn't mean it like that," Ethan wrote. "You misunderstood us," Lauren added. They asked to talk. They asked to explain. They asked if they could come over, just for a few minutes. I still said nothing. Then came the anger. Ethan accused me of overreacting. He said I was being dramatic. He said family doesn't treat each other this way. Lauren warned me I was damaging relationships that couldn't be repaired, that I was acting out of spite, that I would regret this later. They spoke as if my money had always been part of their plan, and my refusal was a betrayal. What struck me most was what they did not say. They did not apologize for the forged signature. They did not acknowledge the money taken. They did not ask how this had affected me. They asked only for things to go back to the way they were. When that didn't work, the tone softened again. Almost pleading. They said they were under pressure. That things were tight. That they needed help, just for now. They reminded me of the past, of everything they had done, of what family was supposed to mean. I read every message carefully, sometimes twice. None of them were about remorse. None were about responsibility. All were about loss of control. A week later, Ethan called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered that one, not because I owed him anything, but because I was ready to hear whatever he had left to say. His voice sounded different. Smaller. Less certain. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. I looked out the window at the lilac bush by the fence, the buds just beginning to open. "Because you told me you wouldn't take care of me," I said. "And because someone took my money anyway." There was a long pause. "That's not fair," he said at last. "No," I replied quietly. "What happened before wasn't fair." I ended the call. After that, the messages slowed. Then stopped. I heard later, through someone else, that they were struggling. That plans had fallen apart. That they hadn't expected things to change so suddenly. I didn't ask questions. Consequences don't need commentary. What surprised me was how little satisfaction I felt. There was no victory in it. No pleasure. Just a calm understanding that this was the natural result of decisions they had made long before that morning. I hadn't exposed them. I hadn't embarrassed them. I hadn't raised my voice. I had simply stepped out of reach. And without someone to lean on without permission, they were forced to stand where I had always stood, on their own. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. Not because everything was resolved, but because it was no longer mine to fix. When the noise finally stopped, I was left with something I hadn't felt in a long time: space. No messages blinking on my phone. No explanations forming in my head. No pressure to decide how much of myself I was supposed to give away in order to keep the peace. The quiet was not empty. It was earned. I thought forgiveness might come next. People like to talk about it as if it's the natural ending, the graceful thing a mother should offer. I considered it carefully, the way I considered everything now. I turned the word over in my mind and asked myself what it would require of me. Forgiveness, I realized, would have meant pretending the betrayal hadn't been deliberate. It would have meant reopening doors I had closed for a reason. It would have meant sacrificing clarity for comfort. I didn't choose that. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. But out of self-respect. I had spent too many years explaining myself, softening truths, accepting discomfort so others wouldn't have to. I was done negotiating my worth. I didn't need apologies shaped like excuses. I didn't need affection that depended on access. I didn't need to be understood by people who had already decided who I was to them. So I chose peace. Peace looked quieter than I expected. It looked like mornings without tension. Like checking my accounts and finding only my own decisions there. Like sitting at my table without rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I chose dignity. Dignity meant standing by what I knew to be true, even when it cost me the illusion of family harmony. It meant accepting grief without letting it rewrite my boundaries. It meant understanding that love does not require endurance of harm. And finally, I chose myself. Not the version of me who needed approval. Not the version who kept things together for everyone else. But the woman I had always been before I doubted her judgment. Capable. Clear. Responsible for her own life. I did not announce my choice. I did not demand understanding. I simply lived it. Some doors, once closed, do not need to be guarded. They hold because you are no longer willing to open them. And in that decision, quiet and final, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing all along, my own voice, steady and unapologetic, telling me I had done enough. Life became quieter after that, but not empty. The days settled into a rhythm that belonged only to me. Mornings began without tension, without checking my phone first, without bracing myself for someone else's needs. I drank my coffee slowly now, sitting by the window, watching the light move across the floor. The house felt like mine again. I traveled a little. Nothing extravagant. Short trips, familiar places, a suitcase packed carefully and lightly. I joined a small volunteer group at the library, shelving books and reading to children on Thursdays. I made friends who asked about my opinions instead of my assets. People who listened without calculating. I laughed again, quietly at first, then without thinking about it at all. There are moments when grief still visits. It sits beside me like an old acquaintance, reminding me that love existed, even if it changed shape. I allow that feeling. I don't argue with it. But I don't let it rewrite my choices. What I learned is simple, though it took me a lifetime to understand. Sometimes the strongest thing a mother can do is stop rescuing the people who chose not to stand by her. Not out of cruelty. Not out of punishment. But out of truth. I did not lose my family that day. I found myself. And if this story touched something tender in you, if it sounded like a truth you've been carrying quietly, know this: choosing yourself is not abandonment. It is survival with dignity. If this spoke to you, you belong here. Subscribe to hear stories where silence becomes strength. I am still standing. And I am finally at peace.